Welcome, everybody. Welcome into our virtual co-opting AI space for the 49th time today for a wonderful conversation. Come in, make yourself comfortable wherever you are. We have amazing guests today and a very intriguing and interesting conversation lined up for you. My name is Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist. I study the intersection of AI and society. I am the host of the Co-opting AI series. I'm currently an assistant professor of data science and media studies at the University of Virginia. And with my lab, Sloane Lab, we do work on how AI changes or sustains the organization of social life. I'm thrilled to welcome you back. We had our first event of the season a month ago on museums, and I always take this opportunity to extend a heartfelt thanks to the wonderful people who make this possible, chiefly the team at the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab at UVA, and of course the team at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. None of this could happen without them. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land that we here at UVA are working on is the homeland and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation, and we pay respect to the elders and knowledge keepers, past and present. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the enslaved Africans, enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built UVA, as well as their descendants. Now, today, we are turning to a massive elephant in the AI room, and that is privacy. I think it is fair to say that not much AI would be possible with some form of privacy invasion, simply because AI is not possible without enormous amounts of data. If the idea is that we need big data to build models of social worlds, of language, of vision, of culture, and so on, then that seems impossible to do without letting automated data collection systems, think about browsers, think about cameras, think about your phone, and much more, how these get into our business. Data for AI is collected as we move through our digitally mediated work. And of course, we have to acknowledge that who deserves and is afforded privacy varies. For centuries, communities who are already disadvantaged and have often been over-surveilled suffer higher levels of privacy invasion, whether in the form of worker surveillance, sometimes in forced conditions, surveillance in the name of crime prevention, for example, or often gendered surveillance of bodies. Now, as generative AI enters the scene, privacy concerns also take on new forms. We know of the use of generative AI in revenge porn scenarios, even among children and teenagers. And these, of course, leave deep scars among victims and reshuffle notions of privacy and safety for our youngest members of society. And so it seems particularly urgent to look at the intersection of AI and privacy. And I genuinely could not be more humbled and honored to welcome two superstars to help us think through some of these thorny issues. Jasmine McNealy and Danielle Citron. Beginning today will be Jasmine McNealy, who is a professor in the Department of Media Production, Management, and Technology at the University of Florida, where she studies information, communication, and technology with a view toward influencing law and policy. Her research focuses on privacy, online media, and communities. Jasmine is also a former senior fellow in tech policy with the Mozilla Foundation and a faculty associate with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She has a PhD in mass communication with an emphasis in media law and a JD from the University of Florida and a Bachelor of Science degree in both journalism and Afro-American studies from the University of Wisconsin. Wow. Following Jasmine will be UVA's very own Danielle Citron, who is the Jefferson Scholars Foundation Schenck Distinguished Professor in Law and Catalan Chapman Professor of Law at the University of Virginia. She writes and teaches about privacy, free expression, and civil rights. Her scholarship and advocacy have been recognized nationally and internationally. In 2019, Danielle was named a MacArthur Fellow based on her work on cyberstalking and intimate privacy. In 2024, she received the International Association of Privacy Professionals Leadership Award, and in 2015, the United Kingdom's Prospect magazine named her one of the top 50 world thinkers. I also think she's the leading, most cited legal scholar in the US at the moment. In 21, she was named the inaugural director of the school's Law Tech Center, which focuses on pressing questions on law and technology. She has a book out called The Fight for Privacy, Protecting Dignity, Identity, and Love in the Digital Age. Highly recommend. That came out in 2022. And she has written many op-eds, over 50. You can also find her online. Now, a heartfelt and humble and warm welcome to these wonderful scholars today. Thank you so much, Jasmine and Danielle, for being here. A few words of housekeeping before I ask Jasmine to start us off. Both of our guests, as per usual, will provide us with a provocation. As they speak, I invite you, the audience, to please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will collect those and fold those into the conversation. Now, enough from me. Thank you for being here. Wonderful audience, wonderful guests. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, everyone. So glad to be with you all today to talk about privacy. One of the things that I could probably talk about a lot, and I'm so honored to get to hear from Danielle as well. And because privacy is something that's in the news every day, perhaps on an hourly basis, and when you layer privacy and technology together, there's even more to talk about, not the least of which is 23andMe, which just filed for bankruptcy protection in the news. So I was like, wait, maybe I should talk about that instead of this. But I think it all connects. And how it connects is I think there's a intense conflict between who we are and who we're computed to be, and what that means for us as we have to uh, participate in systems that want to know what and who we are. For some of us, the stakes are even higher and the impacts are disparate with respect to what is computed and what is how we are identified. Are we a good risk? Are we a good candidate? Do we deserve to live here? Should we be the person for the job? Do we belong? These are the kinds of questions that the machines are answering based off of snapshots, millions and billions of snapshots being used to predict and infer who and what we are. And I think we have a problem with listening to the computation versus understanding who people are. And I want to illustrate that from one area of privacy that I've been working on for a while now. It has to deal with sound. I like sound. Sound to me is illustrative of so much of who we are. I'm a music head, love music. But music says a lot about you, or it can, right? Even the recommendations that we get on whatever recommendation system that we have can tell, or at least predict, some things about you. But also the sounds that we make can predict, or be used at least to predict, a lot about it. So At the end of February of this year, MTA, famed subway system in New York City, announced that it was partnering with Google Public Sector to collect sound. And this collection of sound was going to be used to diagnose issues with the subway. So it'd be a sensors basically attached to people's phones, and the phones would compute. I'm making this very simple. Computer scientists in the audience, don't come for me, but make it very simple. The sounds would be computed to help diagnose, like, what is that noise? This would be the old way. We would go to the mechanic and try to replicate with our mouths the sounds that our cars were making. Well, this was the updated version, using a phone to hear, to listen, and then to diagnose what is going on. Here's the thing: when you have a system like this, it's not just the sound of the tracks, it's not just the sound of the train that's going to be collected. It never is. Basically, what we're talking about is going to be a collection of sonic data. So representations and observations that define the characteristics of sounds, and it's cognitive. So how we make those diagnoses, oh, we have some bad brakes, we have a loose screw, whatever, but also the emotive forces. Now the emotive forces are from us, right? Basically what I'm talking about is bioacoustics for humans. Bioacoustics is not too old, but kind of old science where sounds are collected and they can tell you a lot about what's going on in the environment. It's used a lot to think about biodiversity. Like, are there these kinds of birds here? Are these animals actually extinct? Do we have a good array of different kinds of animals in certain kinds of ecosystems, right? Those are great things. But what about when it comes to us? Do we want to be characterized in the same way? Let me give you another example. So the MTA is one example, but another example, more common example, unfortunately perhaps, that you probably heard about is ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is bioacoustics for humans. And it's not just diagnosing where perhaps that there was a gunshot or something at least that sounded like a gunshot, but it also picks up voices. There have been cases, legal cases, where there was audio from a sensor system. And so the question becomes, what happens with these sounds that are collected with humans? Another great example, not great perhaps, but another example in this system happened over the pandemic, where there were numerous apps that you could put on your phone in which you could cough and they would give you a diagnosis of whether or not you had COVID, maybe you have TB, maybe it's just a flu. Now, whether or not they were actually accurate is a totally different conversation, but there was this collection of this data for humans for which a system was being made and a prediction was being made about you. We have absolutely no idea now where this store of cost is and how it's being used. So why do I care? Because your sound tells so much about you, or at least can be attached to you, and inferences or predictions can be made about you. ShotSpotter used in schools, used in neighborhoods, and having this sound ecology, this sound in a negative sense, the sonic data in a negative sense being attached more to certain kinds of people than others, and those predictions being obviously negative. But like, how do we deal with this? I've been thinking about, like, sound is what it is. And even if the sensors don't hear it, we hear it sometimes, right? So what do we do with this? How do we deal with something that humans can hear, but computers can hear as well? And I thought about this idea of hearing versus listening. So I can hear a sound, but I don't necessarily need to go through the process of processing it and then making a judgment about it that I retain. and then used to predict. Hearing, recognition, involving an input of sound from a source and an understanding of it. But listening, perhaps the computation, is more of an intensive, an active processing of sound. And then the use of that diagnosis, that prediction, that inference, often in ways that we don't really understand or can't really imagine having such a negative possibility. But as we see from ShotSpotter and other similar systems that we have very little control over, that can happen. That once a sound is made, once a sound is processed, it could be used in so many different ways. I think that's indicative of artificial intelligence, and not just generative AI, but artificial intelligence and other technologies in general. Once data is used, collected, used, and entered into this ecosystem, we have very little, if any, control over it. And also, we have very little, if any, control over the impacts after it's in the system. We do, however, have the possibility of making interventions before. And I think that in the United States, particularly, we are behind. The states have come in and tried to help, but we absolutely need federal intervention into this space. And that intervention needs to be on the side of us retaining some kind of authority over deciding who we are instead of machines and those in control of the machines deciding who we are and what we could be. And that's my thought for this.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for sharing that. And I have a ton of thoughts and questions already in my head, but I'm going to hand it over to Danielle and just remind our audience that you are more than welcome to pop your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll start to fold them in later as we start our discussion. Thank you, Jasmine. Danielle, over to you.
Thank you so much. Mona, thank you so much for having us. And it's wonderful to be alongside Jasmine, as always. And I loved that, just to pop briefly on the idea of music, which I'm not going to talk about, but that I gave me a lot of joy. That had a massive dopamine hit at the thought I'm like a Spotify super user. And I make sort of playlists for my classes. So there's a Privacy 2025 playlist for my students. And so you just gave me a jolt of joy. At a time where it's hard to have a lot of joy as we think about privacy violations, right, in the news, indeed, every day. And what I'm going to talk about, and I love the framing, Jasmine, of like the choices that we make and who we make legible, right? Who we see, and who are the who and how in the data that we become in these systems to make decisions, to classify, to categorize, to synthesize data. And I'm going to talk a bit about the ways in which women, LGBTQ individuals, and people of color are seen in systems. And in particular, I'm going to talk about non-consensual intimate imagery, as well as intimate information, information about the body, about our thoughts, about our close relationships. And I'll focus a bit on health information that skews toward, just as an example, is Femtech Act, but more often that we see women and girls use, and the kinds of information that we're using to mine, to categorize, right, to classify, as you helped remind us. All the ways that we're using automation in different ways. To bring us back to the theme of the whole project motive that you're working on, which is, of course, AI and the role that it plays in society. Okay, so first, the intimate privacy violations that have a disproportionate impact on women in marginalized communities. So non-consensual intimate imagery is a growth industry. And that is, of course, the most depressing thing to say out loud, but it is, so that there are 9,500 sites whose raison d'etre is the sharing of non-consensual, either non-consensually made, manufactured, so in the ideas of deepfakes, and then distributed intimate images. So those sites, they are a growth industry in the United States because they enjoy immunity or shielded from responsibility under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And what you find when you look at these sites, and these sites that are training systems, like as we think, I always tell my students, AI is us and us isn't pretty, right? That us is the internet, the publicly facing internet, and the publicly facing internet with these sites of non-consensual intimate imagery. So it's, of course, nudity that someone didn't want to disclose, and it's often not, they're sort of like they're images of exploitation, but it's often not the most, I mean, it's not pornography in the sense that it's not good looking, there's not great lighting, but it's exploitation and shame. It's people who just don't want to have their nude images shared with others. And more often than not, so on these 9,500 sites that are more often housed in the United States because they enjoy immunity from responsibility, more often people who are pictured are women, they're LGBTQ individuals, and more often they are having a marginalized identity of another sort. So integrate that, right? And so that's what's training a lot of, as we say, like, what are we training synthetic data on, these generative adversarial network, whether we're creating synthetic data or we're just training, images to synthesize. We're training it on people whose images they don't want there, right? It's not just, of course, everyday people whose faces are going into the Clearview AI database, right? For example. But what we're seeing is, of course, whether it's CSAM or non-consensual intimate imagery, it more often is, it's shouldered by, for CSAM, it's obviously children. And for non-consensual intimate imagery, it's shouldered by women and people from marginalized communities. Okay, so that's just the wonderful point about who's legible, right? Who is seen, who is captured, as Jasmine, you're saying, who are we seeing and who are we hearing, right? That is more often, we're talking about imagery and non-consensual intimate imagery. It is women in marginalized communities. Okay, so that's the imagery kind of part of the story. Now, what about intimate data, right? Because of course, data that's about our intimate lives, whether it's our relationships, our bodies, our health, our innermost thoughts. It could be about any and all of us. And it is any and all of us, right? But particularly when it comes to health information, we find that more often than not, the folks who use or super users of health apps are more often women and girls. And so what kind of information, let's just take femtech apps, kind of information is being collected. So of course, it's not just about sharing, when you had your period, when are you ovulating, you think, right? And what is being gathered? It's sort of on the theme of seductive surveillance. It's really gamified. And so when you use a, period tracking app, it's not just about kind of really basic health information and women's cycles, but it is I was just telling this to my students the other day, and they were like, really? Half the class are male. And they were like, no kidding. I didn't know this was going on in, period tracking apps, but it's like, who are you sleeping with? How many times have you had sex? Have you orgasmed? Right. And often these sites, these apps will ask, you know, names, right? Like it's your diary for yourself, it says, but it's like who you're sleeping with. So their names are included, what it is, your bodily fluids, your temperature. So lots of information about your bodies and your health. And, if we think about it, those kinds of details we think are that, these companies and apps tell us, this is great. This is for us. It helps us feel more in control. And we're on your side, right? And half of the apps in the App Store that are free they're selling their data, right? So lest we think that all this is for us and it's just on our side and it's really just to help us manage and control our bodies or for ourselves, right? It's not just for ourselves. We don't, as we sharing this data, as it's sort of coming out of our hands, we don't see it, right? We can't experience viscerally how it's being shared, but it's being shared with third parties. That is advertisers, marketers, data brokers, and it's being used to train systems, right? So that all and used to make decisions about us, to classify us, to score us, to rank us and rate us. Why is it that so much of this information is valuable, right? It's valuable in part because it can help us tailor advertising, but also it's also valuable to help it it is just used to justify increasing our premiums, our health insurance premiums, our eligibility for life insurance, right? It is being used to make decisions, right? To classify us and score and rank and rate us, and the risks, our risk assessment, right? Which is used for important life opportunities, whether we get jobs or promotions. Well, listen, if you've got really bad, painful cramps, maybe I don't want to hire you, right? Or maybe I'm going to assess you as someone who comes with risks because you've shared on hims or hers that you've got, certain kinds of problems. Maybe I'm not interested in having you for a job, right? And so the kinds of issues that I've been thinking about, of course, aren't just non-consensual intimate imagery and the way in which intimate information, the collection of information that skews towards women and girls, but I think it's important for us to realize that we're being measured and we're measuring ourselves not in ways that we think are good for us and that help us, but in ways that help others, right? That are being used to make judgments about us that we never get to interrogate, right? What do they say? The jobs you don't know about, that you didn't get, that you never got the interview for, right? There's so much opacity. And Jasmine, as you were saying, that it's replicable, right? That all this data that's gathered about us, whether it's sound, right, or it's our imagery or health information, all of that is like it's forever. It doesn't cost any money to repeat it and to use it and to share it, right? And so that it is all upsides for everyone else but us, right? So I hope that helps round out the provocations. Mona, that you're not disappointed, certainly in me. You would never be disappointed in Jasmine, but you might be in me. But I hope that's sufficient to, what do they say, join the question. And then we can then have a conversation with the three of us.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I would never be disappointed in you ever. And thank you again, Jasmine, for your contribution. So this is another call for the audience members to start putting questions into the Q&A box. I'm going to sort of take chair's privilege, if you will, or moderator's privilege, and start asking some questions. So one of the things that I sort of hear often is we need meaningful consent. If people only knew better, they would make better decisions about what data is collected, if it is used for a training or not, and or how it is used. Maybe there are, innovative ways of thinking about it, consent in terms of, can we steer the AI training process or the merging of our worlds with AI in a way that becomes more meaningful to us? And so then I hear both of you sort of speak to this, but hang on, maybe consent or even meaningful consent is not gonna get us anywhere. Could you maybe both speak to this meaningful consent mantra, if you will, that we hear very often? Maybe Jasmine, we'll start with you.
Okay, yeah. So consent won't save us at all. Consent is a great idea, and we use it a lot in biohealth, biomedicine, right? We want informed consent, but outside of health as well, though, it is putting the onus on the individual to make a decision about themselves that they have absolutely no expertise, an idea, couldn't even imagine what they could be used for, either right then or in the future. And I say that because the organizations don't know what they're going to use the data for right then or possibly in the future. So it's really, it ignores the inherent power imbalance between an individual and an organization. And whether that organization is the corporate organizations that we harp on a lot, right, the usual suspects, or it's the government, or it's civil society organizations who also participate in this AI ecosystem. That, oh, we could use it for this, and it could be so good for this. But they are engaging in the same behaviors as we say that it's bad for corporations and sometimes governments to engage in. But going back to my point, there's a power imbalance here. We can't put the onus on individuals to make good choices. That can't happen. Also, just as far as bandwidth, we have a whole lot of other stuff that we have to think about and deal with. Making a decision at one point about the rest of your life, basically, how you're going to be used, how you as data are going to be used, is an incredible burden to attempt to put on individuals. And that's what we've been doing. That's what consent does. Consent doesn't work in the way that we need it to.
Okay, we want me to pop in. Okay, so I'm gonna echo Jasmine, that kind of idea of consent as both magical and it's myth, right? So of course we think of consent as like sprinkling fairy dust on all the things, right? That consent can cure all the problems, and that also can answer. That is, autonomy is why we care. Agency is why we care about privacy, and that's not to say that agency and identity development and autonomy aren't incredibly important part of the story of why we care about privacy. It is, right? Making decisions, meaningful decisions, right? Well, as you said, like, can we make meaning making around the idea of like saying, yes, you can use my data and have it be meaningful and then stand the test of time, Jasmine, as you're saying, like in the longer tail, like it's going to stay. Endpoint one, it's going to make sense at endpoint 150, right? And there's so much more to privacy than just, of course, about autonomy. It includes our own sort of self-esteem and self-assessment. Even if we could consent, it may be the kind of thing we look back and say, I feel like wasn't the kind of decision that I would make. And I feel like my integrity is on the line in some way, or my own self-respect, right? Um, but even if so, that's like, we think it's magical, right? We look at consent and it has some moral magical force behind it in some way. And the truth of the matter, it's much more myth than it is real. Particularly, Jasmine, I'm just going to echo what you were saying, like in any given moment, we can't possibly, and this goes to our friend Lori Kramer, whose work we've relied on now for like 15 years, which is we could never read every privacy policy that we ever came encounter with. We'd have to spend, I think it's something like 3 weeks it would take us to get through every single privacy policy in a given year. I don't got no 3 weeks to read every single privacy policy that's in front of me. And B, those privacy policies, as our colleague Woody Hartzog would say, is an anti-privacy policy. It says, sucks for you, you have no privacy, excuse me. So it's not as if it's giving us any kind of choice, right? This is like, it's a myth, right? And we just click, we agree. And that's why I always say to my students, like GDPR, schmedpr, it's not doing that much for us, because even if they ask us specifically, you can make a choice and you can decide, if you want to have cookies or have the least restrictive kind of, you can make these choices. No one's making these choices. We're just clicking, keep me going, as every single student of mine says, like, I want to get going to the service I want and the product I want, so that it isn't meaningful, right? And Jasmine, as you were noting in the health context, right, we think of the times where we can, and sex, think about the moments where we can express our will. There are lots of places and spaces in which we express our choice, right? And we think we have that kind of space to say no. We want hopes, right? And you think of medical decision making, like, we're told the risks of a procedure and we sit and we think about it. And at the very least, we have an opportunity to say, you know what, let me think about it. I'll schedule that procedure at my will, right? There are relationships and spaces in which we have some moment, some space and time to answer and change or have a real meaningful will. when it comes to our data, right, all day long as we like, click, and share, and we browse, it's almost it's both an impossibility, and we give it a lot of weight that we shouldn't, right? So I feel like we were in heated agreement, but I wanted to just like emphasize both the magic that it sort of incites in all of us. It does so much work, and that B, it's useless or meaningless, I should say, rather than, as Mona, as you asked, like, can we make it meaningful? I fear that in an information age, not really.
Thank you for that. And that is also so important as we really take the promise of AI at face value, if you will, which is that it's adaptive, it learns, future-proof, all these things. And, they're wonderful applications that work very well. We know about AI and data analytics working extremely well in very particular scientific endeavors and all these kinds of things, right? But so there are these interesting frictions, if you will. I'm going to start folding in questions because they're coming in and they're amazing. So just to sort of get us all on the same page, Danielle, could you maybe explain very briefly how do data sales work? You alluded to that a little bit, but how do data sales work? Who who buys that data? How does this whole ecosystem work? Very briefly, especially about the intimate data.
You bet. Okay, so in the United States, we have a sort of our default is that we can collect, use, share, and sell data no matter how intimate. Unless and the only caveat is, of course, is you can't lie. And in certain circumstances, we might understand a practice to be unfair, right? And there's some state laws, right? Jasmine, you're referring to some state laws, but they're basically permission structures to collect and sell. And it's only when we invoke rights that we're choking on that we don't use, right? That we might be able to say, delete my data like 23andMe, right? The California AG is encouraging everyone to delete your data. If you live in California, you can, and you have that right. In Virginia, we got no such rights, sadly. That is to insist upon deleting our sensitive data, I think. So, the whole ecosystem of the surveillance economy is a yes, right? And so you ask, like, what's animating and why do we allow the kind of sale and resale? And why are there 4,000 data brokers that have 10,000 data points on every single one of us? And I think we're categorized into something like 650,000. I didn't think I'm that interesting, but each and every one of us are in some categorization along 650,000 different types, right? Jasmine, I hope I'm correct in saying this. And and you'd be amazed how we are sliced and diced, right? And it is so lucrative. And so to answer, I hope I'm answering the question of, like, why is this permissible? How does this work? It works because it is amazingly lucrative, right? To be in the business of buying and selling. And because we don't have, as Jasmine noted, a comprehensive federal privacy law that would have substantive restrictions on the collection of sensitive information, at least not yet, nor do we see them really around the globe. That is strong, you cannot collect, right? We have one state, Maryland, that says you cannot sell sensitive information, right? That's like one of my 4 rules in my book, like core commitments. We should say we shouldn't sell intimate data, period. Sorry, no one gets to, right? You've got to ask me personally, like, I can't be sold onward. And that's our problem in the United States, is like we live in a truly frictionless sharing and sell environment with some speed bumps, but they're really small speed bumps.
Which is also interesting because it reiterates this sort of idea that AI is a productive force, right? And it reproduces sort of social distinction, social organization, all of that. Benjamin has, of course, been speaking about those for, I think, 6 years at this point. Jasmine, I have a question for you before I start bringing in even more questions from the audience. Keep them coming, dear audience members. They're wonderful. So Danielle said, we don't, and both of you said we don't have comprehensive privacy policy or law. We also have the problems around consent, which consent seems to be fairly well defined, in part because we had to define it as part of scientific research and IRB and all of these things. do we have a good I mean, my apologies for this very basic question. In your opinion, do we have a good definition of privacy anywhere, or is it a lost cause? Or do you know what I mean? Like, what about that term? Is that a useful term?
I think it's useful in that it identifies a range of issues and topics related to what we consider privacy. So Danielle mentioned some earlier: autonomy, agency, but I'll throw out Woody as well, obscurity. We have things like just basically choice, right? Like all of those things, which is autonomy, but you get what I'm saying. So there's a range of different um, psychosocial issues that fall under what we consider privacy. And at any given time, we can talk about any of those or all of those all at once. So privacy is not as exacting as perhaps we'd want it to be, but it does cover a wide range. And what we see is that in some attempts at law, there'll be coverage for certain things. I think the states have the torts pretty well in hand, like the invasion of privacy torts, many of the states have. But the other kinds of privacy-ish things, they don't do well with. They're hard to define, they're hard to unfortunately quantify, dare we say. And so it's hard for policymakers to create um, more specific kind of rules or regulations surrounding them. I think, though, that privacy is still a good word, but it encompasses so much more than just the uh, traditional things we think about with privacy, especially with more and more innovations. It's more and more stuff that comes under this umbrella. I think also sometimes we're talking about actually security or data security as well, mixed into the privacy. We're talking about governance, really, of data mixed into the privacy. We're talking about anti-surveillance mixed into the privacy. So it's a lot of things, but I still think it's a useful term. It just covers so much.
And it kind of has historically at least allowed all these different actors to talk to one another, right? So we've not really had, I mean, at least later, allergic reactions across the board or things like that. And so in that sense, it almost works as, science technology folks would say almost a boundary object, right? It crosses like places and time and allows us to work on this. Danielle, I'm going to ask you to respond very briefly to privacy, yay or nay.
I mean, this is like, of course, it's a yay as a privacy scholar. And I think we shouldn't sell short the notion that there are certain kinds of privacy that we think deserve are foundational to who we are as an us, not as a me, but as a we, right? And I think that includes the ways in which we draw boundaries around our intimate lives. So that's information about and access to those core things like our health, our bodies, our closest relationships, our innermost thoughts, right? Our sex, sexual orientations, gender, sexual activities, and our closest relationships. And we have what's interesting about intimate privacy as a foundational value is it's really cross-cultural. That is, there's all sorts of ways that's really interesting, like conversations that I had in writing my second book with folks in South Korea, in India, in Iceland, in the United States, UK, Australia, interviewing folks from across the globe. That is the kind of privacy that we want, that we expect, and that we deserve in our bodies, in our relationships, right? And that's in physical and digital spaces, and the technologies that enable those relationships is something it's got variance, of course, culturally, but there are so many echoing themes of the kind of privacy that we want and that we articulate expecting and that we deserve for human flourishing. So I'm definitely not giving up in any way on the definition, but I'm agreeing, Jasmine, with the idea that there's a lot of intersecting concerns, but we've been working on, even before 1890 and Warren and Brandeis's The Right to Privacy, we've had federal privacy law since 1790 and the US Postal Act, like never give up on the USPS, right? And our foundational constitutional, in the Bill of Rights, the first, the third, the fourth, like the fifth, the 14th, like they are premised on notions of privacy, right? The ability to speak is because we give ourselves some off stage time so we can figure out what we want to say, right? And that same is true for the Third Amendment. Get the heck out of my house. I'm not going to get troops, right? So that it's as old, certainly, as our country, if we can keep it at this point. And that is, there are norms and practices around privacy that have evolved and that are centuries now old in the United States, let alone outside the United States. So I feel pretty confident in saying that privacy is a thing that we want and that we expect and that we deserve.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate the contextualization and the responses to that. I'm going to bring us back to our audience a little bit. And Jasmine, there seems to be folks seem to really resonate with the idea that sound is extremely intimate, personal, and so on. And there are a bunch of questions around that. So we have one question that's specifically about the MTA program and is tied to a little worry. Namely the worry that perhaps generative AI is used for transcription. So this question is the following: in your opinion, is the threat of sound recordings of public spaces that the recordings are being made, or that it is so easy to transcribe and process by machines with large language models? So is the tail getting longer, in your opinion?
So the tail is getting longer, definitely. But I think both of those are concerns for me. One, that it's being collected, period, right? That the sound is being collected. Sounds actually are being collected, but also then that it's being transcribed or analyzed for what, who, what, when, where, why, perhaps. Those questions are being asked of machines. And whether they get it right or whether they get it wrong, both of those are really big issues. Error has implications for privacy as well. And we've seen that over and over, the implications of like these errors with respect to transcription and what can happen. So it's both of those things that are concerning to me with respect to the collection of sound and then the processing of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe you can both speak to another question that I actually also had, which was, what are, other than health apps and the MTA example that we heard about, what are the moments in which information is being collected from us, especially intimate information? I guess we all sort of know about, when you click on ads or when you browse the internet, depends on what settings you have, but this is where data is collected. But what are other moments in which these mundane privacy invasions happen, often in an effort to collect data that is used to build these models of the world, if you will? Danielle, maybe you can start, and Jasmine, you can chime in so we can give folks a bigger picture.
Okay, so don't sell browsing short, right? We go to WebMD. Feel like any hospital, as we browse, it's amazing that kind of like if you linger on a page, or even, right, not even like you clicked on something and you like hover a little over something, it could be then collected and inferred that you have or might have type 1 diabetes or pancreatic cancer, right? So it's amazing that our everyday browsing, our purchases are quickly intimate in 5 seconds. Like I go to CVS and I buy alcohol swipes, and immediately we think, all right, she's got type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, right? I'm trying to think of health information that's so easy to infer. You use Grindr and Tinder. Like dating apps have this amazing story of a journalist who said she, had made a GDPR request of all of her information on Tinder. And when she sat with it, was something like 800 pages of, as she said, stuff I didn't even know about my own sexuality. Like I didn't know this is what turned me on. In fact, or it didn't turn me on, but it is amazing what we reveal just without even thinking. And that's just it's not even the conversations, it's the people that you looked at, you swiped on, you didn't swipe on. It is so it is amazing the kind of information that we reveal. And sometimes when we amass information, that is, as we gather the most innocuous data points about us, that in two hops it's pretty revealing, right? What do they say? Like, I feel like Ryan Kayla would say, like, it's pretty fast, we infer from the intimate, from the prosaic, the most intimate, right? And it happens so quickly. And I would say our searches are so deeply personal. Our reading habits, I'm channeling Neil Richards now with intellectual privacy and Julie Cohen, but it is amazing. Like our reading habits, our searches tell us about who we are and what we're thinking about. Right? It's like the libraries of yore. Our librarians are the guardians at the gate for our intellectual privacy. But unfortunately, Google is not my librarian at the law school. I wish. Right? Everyone was like Leslie Ashbrook or Kate Bedoris, our librarians here at the law school, right? They will protect my reading habits, no question, lay down on the tracks. Google won't care, it's selling it. Right. So I think, we should realize that intimate information is inferred really quickly from really prosaic information that we reveal, and B, it's amazing how much we share all day long without even realizing it.
Yeah, I think everything that Danielle said is absolutely spot on. And I also would say, like, let's add the extra part of that, or the network part of that, and that is that there's a rationale for wanting to know so much about you. And that some of the time, many of the times, is to hopefully get you to buy something, or to engage with some service or something, to get value from you. And so we talked about earlier those points of categorization. Those can also be thought of as, like, thank our marketers, our advertisers, for many of those points, because how do we appeal to your demographic? And that is, we need to know who you are, or at least who we think you are. So if we're thinking about, you listen to what song on Spotify, YouTube, where SoundCloud, wherever you listen to it, did you write something in a post about K-pop? Can we make an inference about you related to supposedly the kind of music you may or may not like? All of those things matter, because I can get closer to perhaps enticing you into something. I think that's really important to think about for privacy as well, is like, why? What's the rationale? You are valuable, right? In many different frames and ways, but you are invaluable to the people who want to collect this data, and also the people who they sell it to, or the organizations they sell it to as well.
Yeah, and that can be totally disconnected from the product or the problem it is supposed to solve, right? And or the thing it's supposed to infer, and questions around, things like construct, validity, and these kind of things that scientists like tend to think about in that context completely sort of disappear. Thank you for that. I'm going to bring in a question from a dear colleague, Dr. David Nemmer, who says, so much of the conversation around AI focuses on tools and data, but there's far less attention on how data archives themselves are negotiated and structured by a given social infrastructure, which for him is people, to deliberately reinforce existing biases and power structures. How might we imagine or design a data archive or repository that doesn't amplify these biases or uphold the status quo? but instead works to challenge and overcome them, or dismantle such social infrastructures at the core of defining these data archives? So that's a big question, but it's one that goes back to data brokers, data collection, reusing, harvesting data. Jasmine, I'm going to stay with you if you could speak to that briefly, and then I'm going to bring in more questions as we move on.
So I'm going to solve this in 1 minute, of course, David. But I think that's a rough one, because inherently there's going to be bias in a system of data collection. You have to make choices, and I'm not saying all bias is equal, but there's going to be bias there. The problem is the bias that we're talking about currently is based on the kind of bias that systemically disenfranchises, that marginalizes, that creates vulnerabilities, and keeps people in socioeconomic statuses that it's hard to get out of, right? So how do we create a data archive system that does not include those systemic biases, that would require the participation of the people who would be in the data? Can you have a structure of community governance in a way, and this is being attempted by several different people, some of them in like the health or biomedicine context? Can you create governance structures or allow communities to create governance structures for the data that belongs to themselves? And I'm not using belongs to in like an ownership frame. I know you have that debate, but I'm using it in a way that like you are in the data. How do you, or are you able to govern it and make decisions and come to consensus about what can and cannot be done? What are the kinds of even models that can be made from your data? I think what has to happen is there has to be a mechanism created for communities to be actively involved in consent and governance of data collection, use, storage, access, all of those parts of the life cycle. That doesn't solve everything, but man, it is so different than what we, quite frankly, now have available. And not just for new data structures or data archives, but also those archives we already have. So public records, can we having community involvement with how to rethink, revise, restructure what's collected, how it's collected, and who has access to it, also how it's interpreted? I think we can start to do that and rethink those already established data archives with active participation. And quite frankly, people do want to participate in these kinds of mechanisms and activity.
Thank you for that, Jasmine. And that's so interesting that you say that, because one of the things I often hear is, oh, folks don't care, or they're too busy, or they don't know about these privacy invasions. So there's always an argument about literacy that's not there, which I don't think quite holds anymore. But I'm moving us on, because we've got so many good ones, and audience members, please keep them coming. So I'm gonna shift us towards sort of fixes, and a bunch of questions around that. Jeffrey Perron is saying, well, what about a trustee, like a third party, to evaluate pros and cons of sharing your information, for example? So trustee, there's a fair amount of thinking around that. Then the right to be forgotten, which of course is as prominent in Europe and in the GDPR, and it's an interesting concept. What about that? And then Emmanuel Moss has a question around tech fixes to these kinds of problems. For example, differential privacy or encryption. So I'm curious to hear from both of you on these sort of fixes, whether they are more legal or they are social or they are more decidedly technical. So, trustees or the right to be forgotten, differential privacy, and encryption. Danielle, we'll start with you.
So maybe I'll tackle the right to be forgotten that I think can kind of live or sit with the trustee idea, right? The right to be forgotten, of course, like it's more rights. And we do have, in some sense, some modified rights to be forgotten. Some by law, so the Fair Credit Reporting Act, if you have a criminal conviction or bankruptcy that's over a certain, it's stale, it's like 7 years, 10 years, like you have to leave it off a credit report. And that's, I think, a helpful kind of a default shifting and a required minimization, right? That you don't need to exercise rights. Like it doesn't depend on the resilient self to be exercising all these rights that I'm choking on. I have too many, right? And the right to be forgotten, they're in so many respects, like there are 20 state comprehensive privacy laws, and they have many have rights to ask to delete, right? But I asked my class that literally covered state privacy laws yesterday. And I asked my class, so who's ever made a request? These are 80 privacy students in law school, and not a soul raised their hand, right? Not a soul. Okay. So, the idea of the right to be forgotten can be helpful, and that's especially true of non-consensual intimate imagery. We can ask Google and Bing, thankfully, and Yahoo now since 2015 to de-index non-consensual intimate imagery in searches of your name. And that's thanks to pleading, at the CCR, at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, working with then AG Harris, like got companies to make that choice, like a right to be forgotten that they'd recognize, in victims of non-consensual intimate imagery. So consent in that way, or choice to be forgotten, is so meaningful, right? But as to each and every company, like we don't know the thousands of sites and thousands of data brokers that have our information. And there's one way. So I'm going to take then the trustee idea. So like it's too many rights, we're drowning in them, right? But in California has the Delete Act that as of January 2026, it's a one-stop shop where you can go to the data broker registry in California, or you will be able to, the CC, that's run by the California Consumer Privacy Agency, and once ask all of the data brokers that are registered with California to delete your information. You don't have to go to 4,000 of them or 500 of them as it is now. There are only 583 data brokers registered with the California agency. But in a year, that's like the trustee model. You can trust CCPA, the agency, to then ask companies have to then fulfill your request to delete your data from data brokers. And that's sort of, I think, what the person is. I could be wrong, but the trustee model of like, these are my wishes. You go ahead and carry them out. It's like a law inscribed wish. Not yet, but soon in California. And we just don't have, like, privacy isn't like a big money maker. Like this goes to Jasmine, your insight. It's the, as you said, ready? Who we are and who we're computed to be. Right? We think we are something, but who's computing us? It's the money makers, Jasmine, as you're saying, right? Like, so the incentives around trustee model that, companies don't want to have models, right? Like they want to amass our information. They don't want to delete us. We don't yet have like a trustee who can take my wishes and operationalize them across the web in every company. So it would be cool if we did. Uh, Sign me up for the service. I'll pay for it. I don't think there is such a thing. I think we need law for that.
Agree, totally agree with that. I would just say that the question was, are the fixes legal, social, or technical? I would say it's all of the above, and it has to be. They have to be working in combination. AI and other technologies, the data collection tech, that's a socio-technical issue. You can't just say, oh, it's the technical, and they have to stop doing this, they have to fix this. No, this is about also the social part, and that is how do we persuade in some way people to do something that is valuable for us? And that has been a question that advertisers or marketers have had for time immemorial. Like, you have value, either it's value from money, right? Or it's attention, it's time, it is the like inferences that you give off that tell us something that could possibly be valuable for us. And that's a social thing. Combine that with technology that collects data about you in the background or in the foreground, quite frankly, or also that deceives you into doing things that you otherwise wouldn't do, but for that design or that technology, combined with a lack of regulatory oversight and prohibitions on data collection, use, sale, access, security behaviors, and we are where we are currently. So it's all of those things have to be working in combination. One of the ways, and I think Danielle mentioned this earlier, is having a comprehensive law that says you can't collect data in this way or this kind of data. Shutting that down. That means businesses have to change their business model, and they can do that. And many of them are robust enough to do that. But shutting down like the fire hose has to be one of those things that has to be done, along with the technical and along with the social. The social will be the rough part. Very hard to do, change social structures and beliefs and ideas, but they have to happen in combination.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as Danielle said earlier, AI is us and us ain't pretty, right? So I want to, so there's another cluster of questions that is around agency. What can we do? What can we do as we maybe want to continue using some of these services because they are indeed useful to us? I'm really interested in this notion of usefulness here as well, actually. So especially with regards to period trackers, is there something that can be done? But also there's a question by Avita, and they asked, how can we raise awareness amongst users, especially super users of these health apps or wellness apps, all these kind of things. And then there's another question from Tim Wood, sort of that is in that bucket, at least for me, Tom Wood Powell, who's saying, well, in absence of meaningful regulation, how can we think about self-regulation by code, by policies, or by digital conduct? And I know you just said, well, no, we need the fire hose, we need, we need the law, but at the same time, we're seeing, especially big companies, acting in this sort of as legislators almost, right? So what can folks do who want to keep using these apps? How can we increase literacy? Is that meaningful? And what about self-regulation, which seems to be a situation that we're in right now? And I would love to hear from you both on this cluster. Danielle, maybe you first, and then Jasmine. Thank you.
I'm literally the most depressing person on this. So I don't know if Jasmine, you want to take it over, because I'm so over self-regulation. We've been living in that land for 25 years at the content layer. Section 230, we said, oh, you're going to be good Samaritans, so you can leave up or, block, take down, because we're going to assume that you're going to act like a good Samaritan. And companies in the late 90s said to, state AGs and the Federal Trade Commission and lawmakers, like, don't regulate us. We won't be evil. You know what I mean? Like, we're on your side. I call baloney on that. Right. And so, sorry, I'm like sad and grim. I'm like, we need the law. Right. Whenever I'm asked about tips, like what can we do? Right. And I laughed when my book editors told me that I needed tips at the end of my book. I'm like, this is structural. This is a problem. Right. My best tip was like the sticky on my computer. Sorry, this thingy from Epic, and then talk to your loved ones about, agreements around expression, sexual expression, communications. It's not going to solve for assholes. Sorry, there's so many. I'm going to get in so much trouble, Mona. Um, like I'm supposed to be this lovely, genteel UVA professor. Whoops. Um, like I can't solve for the evil that is in us, right? And so I worry that we're at the place that we're at with a lot of suffering in my world around cyber civil rights and online abuse because we've said, we'll self-discipline, platforms can self-regulate, and I just call nonsense on that. Sorry, depressing.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding self-discipline by the platform or self-discipline like each individual, because self-discipline, yeah, go ahead.
So Tim just clarified and said on the demand side, not on the supply side. But I also want to, so that's a helpful clarification. But I also want to just point back to the question around, I want to keep using a service or a type of service. Is there anything I can do?
It seems like organizations don't really respond to necessarily their consumers until they start losing money. So scandal works, uprising can work, but at the same time, again, that's placing the onus on the individual to do something, right? Take your power back, whatever. And as I said earlier, it doesn't work. It shouldn't be on individuals and groups of individuals or collectives of individuals to attempt to force billion-dollar organizations to change when those organizations have very little incentive to change currently. So literacy is great. Digital literacy, AI literacy, the various literacies is great personal edification. It can't be our remedy for what's ailing us in this area.
And so we're coming back to structure, right? Social structure. And I think though that there's a place for us as educators as well here, right? So we have a comment from Tiffany Esteban, who is they say I'm a librarian from California here, and they're talking about data literacy, but also the particular challenges around AI, tech, social legal environments when it comes to that. So I think personally there's something around what certain communities already know about these problems and maybe the sort of on-the-ground strategies that they've developed, whether that's professional communities or other kinds of communities, or even really small social units such as families. Danielle, you spoke about that. It seems there's a lot to do. We've landed on the need for law. Again, we landed on the macro social and technical dimension. We've also landed on the idea that privacy is a useful term. It includes a lot of concerns. It also is something that can be activated, that has been activated, and that is powerful in that sense. And we should not give up on privacy, particularly as we consider things like innovation and science and all these things that get us excited in our professional lives and our personal lives and so on. We are at time. I want to thank my amazing guests today, Dr. Jasmine McNealy and Danielle Citron. Thank you so much for joining, for giving us the real talk, for being here and sharing the space and energy. I appreciate you. I appreciate my team, and I appreciate you, the audience. Thank you for being here. This conversation is going to go up on the internet, on YouTube. You can watch it. We have more co-opting AI conversations coming up, 2 more next month. April 16th, we will talk about AI and taxes, and we will be welcoming Ruth Bronstein, Eckhard Ernst, and Max Cassie. That will be our 50th show. And then the last one in this season will be on debt on May 14th with the wonderful Simone Brown and Erie Meyer, formerly CFPB. So we'll have lots to talk about. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the week. See you again here and take good care. Thank you.